The gallows-like silence that fell over the church when Grace Zimmerman's pregnancy was announced seemed to stretch into eternity, a silence broken only by the collective intake of breath from Reverend Thompson's congregation. It was 1878 in Silver Reef, Utah Territory, and in this mining town built on dreams of silver and respectability, an unwed mother was considered the lowest of the low. Grace stood at the back of the church, her plain cotton dress unable to hide the swell of her 6-month pregnancy. She had known this moment would come, had postponed it for as long as possible with loose clothing and excuses about feeling unwell. But Silver Reef was too small, and its people too observant for her secret to remain hidden forever. Shame. The first word cut through the silence like a knife, followed quickly by others, until the small church echoed with condemnation. Grace's father, Herbert Zimmerman, owner of the town's general store and a pillar of the community, rose from his pew with a face as hard as the silver ore that had built this town. His wife Sarah remained seated, eyes downcast, hands trembling in her lap. "I will not have this disgrace in my house," Herbert announced, his voice carrying over the murmurs. "No daughter of mine would bring such dishonor to our name." Grace knew what was coming. She had seen it happen to other girls in other towns, the banishment, the cutting of ties. But knowing did not prepare her for the finality of her father's next words. "You are no longer my daughter. You have until sundown to gather your belongings and leave this house and this town." Tears blurred Grace's vision as she turned and pushed through the church doors into the harsh Utah sunlight. The morning was beautiful, with clear blue skies and the distant mountains standing sentinel over the town. It seemed a cruel juxtaposition to the crumbling of her life. At 22, Grace had never been anywhere without her family. Born in Illinois, she had traveled west with them when her father sought opportunity in the burgeoning mining towns. Now she would face the world alone. No, not alone. She placed a protective hand over her belly. She had her child, the result of a brief romance with a mining engineer who had moved on to California months ago, not knowing he had left more behind than just promises. The walk home was interminable, every familiar face turning away as she passed. By the time she reached the family home behind the general store, her chest ached with unshed tears. She moved mechanically through her room, packing what little she could carry: some clothing, a small wooden box containing her mother's cameo brooch, a few precious books, and the meager savings she'd accumulated from working in her father's store. The sound of the bedroom door opening made her turn. Her mother stood there, eyes red-rimmed, holding a small cloth bundle. "I cannot go against your father," Sarah whispered, pressing the bundle into Grace's hands. "But I cannot let you go with nothing." Inside was a purse containing more money than Grace had ever held. "It's what I saved from my egg money. It won't last long, but it might help you find somewhere safe." "Come with me," Grace pleaded, desperate for her mother's familiar comfort. Sarah shook her head, a lifetime of obedience to her husband preventing her from even considering such a thing. "I will pray for you and the child every day." She embraced her daughter briefly, then stepped back, becoming once again the proper wife of Herbert Zimmerman. "The westbound stage passes through in an hour. Your father will be at the store until closing." And that was it, the sum total of her mother's rebellion. Grace shouldered her bag, tucked the money into her pocket, and slipped out the back door of the only home she'd known in Silver Reef. The stagecoach depot was busy with miners and businessmen when Grace arrived. She kept her head down, avoiding the curious and judgmental stares as she purchased a ticket to Cedar City, the next stop west. It wasn't a plan so much as a direction away from here, away from the shame and rejection. The stagecoach arrived in a cloud of dust, and Grace boarded quickly, taking a seat by the window. As the driver cracked his whip and the horses lurched forward, she allowed herself one last look at Silver Reef. The town spread out before her, the church steeple, the miners' cabins, the larger homes of successful businessmen like her father. She wondered if she would ever see it again. The journey to Cedar City was punishing. The stagecoach bounced and rattled over rough terrain, and each jolt sent waves of discomfort through Grace's pregnant body. Her fellow passengers, a traveling salesman and an older couple, maintained a stiff silence after noting her condition and the absence of a wedding ring. By the time they reached Cedar City, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the streets. Grace disembarked stiffly, her back aching and her spirits low. This town was larger than Silver Reef, but still small enough that an unwed mother would find little welcome. "You need a place for the night, miss." The stagecoach driver, a weathered man in his 50s, had noted her uncertain stance on the depot platform. "Yes, somewhere. Respectable but not expensive," Grace replied, clutching her bag tightly. The driver frowned, considering. "Mrs. Hollister's boarding house might take you in for a night or two. It's 3 blocks down, yellow house with a green door. Tell her Jake sent you." He hesitated, then added gruffly, "Good luck to you, miss." It was the first kindness she'd been shown all day, and Grace felt tears threatening again. "Thank you, Jake." Mrs. Hollister proved to be a stern-faced widow who looked Grace up and down with disapproval, but accepted her money for a small room at the back of the house. "1 week," she stated firmly. "I run a respectable establishment." "I understand," Grace said. "I'll be moving on before then." The room was sparse but clean, a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small window overlooking an alley. Grace sank onto the bed, finally allowing the tears to come. She cried for her lost family, for the uncertainty ahead, for the child who would be born with the weight of shame upon its innocent shoulders. When the tears subsided, she washed her face in the basin and forced herself to think practically. She needed work, a more permanent place to stay, and eventually, someone to help her when the baby came. All seemed impossible tasks for an unwed mother to be, but she had no choice but to try. Morning brought little relief from her worries. Grace ate a simple breakfast in Mrs. Hollister's dining room, ignoring the curious glances from other boarders, then set out to explore Cedar City and look for opportunities. The town was bustling, centered around a main street lined with businesses, a general store much like her father's, a bank, a hotel, various shops, and several saloons. Grace approached the general store first, hoping her experience might count for something, but the owner's wife took one look at her condition and shook her head firmly. "We've no positions available," she said coldly, despite the help wanted sign clearly visible in the window. The hotel was similarly unwelcoming, as was the dress shop. By midday, Grace was exhausted, her feet swollen and her hopes dwindling. She sat on a bench outside the post office, wondering how long her mother's money would last and what would become of her and her child. "You look like you could use this." A cup of water appeared before her, held by a young woman about her own age with bright red hair tucked under a practical bonnet. "Thank you," Grace said, accepting the cup gratefully. "I'm Maggie Walsh," the woman said, sitting beside her. "And you're new in town and having a hard time of it." It wasn't a question. Grace nodded. "Grace Zimmerman, I'm looking for work." Maggie's eyes flicked to Grace's midsection. "And finding doors closed to you," she sighed. "It's the way of things, isn't it? Men can do as they please, but women pay the price." Grace stiffened, preparing for judgment, but found none in Maggie's frank gaze. "I work at the Bluebird Cafe," Maggie continued. "It's not fancy, but Mrs. Cooper is fair and she might be willing to give you a chance, at least until—" She gestured vaguely toward Grace's belly. You do that. Help me, Grace asked, hardly daring to hope. Maggie shrugged. I've been in hard places myself. Come on, I'm due back for the lunch rush anyway. The Bluebird Cafe was a small establishment a block off the main street, catering primarily to working men clerks, tradesmen, and the occasional cowboy or miner. Mrs. Cooper, a stout woman in her 40s with streaks of gray in her dark hair, eyed Grace critically but didn't immediately dismiss her. Can you carry plates without dropping them? Count change? Deal with men who think they're funny when they're not? She asked brusquely. Yes, madam, Grace replied. I worked in my father's store for years. I'm good with numbers and people. Mrs. Cooper nodded. I need help through supper. You can start now. Maggie will show you what to do. We'll talk about tomorrow later. It was exhausting work. Grace's back ached fiercely by the end of the day, but she'd earned her first independent wages and the promise of more work tomorrow. Mrs. Cooper had even suggested she might be able to stay in the small room above the cafe when Mrs. Hollister inevitably asked her to leave. It ain't much, Mrs. Cooper had said. Just a bed and a dresser, and you'd share the washroom with me and Maggie. But it's clean and you could work for your keep until the baby comes. After that, well, we'll see. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it was a reprieve, and Grace fell asleep that night with a flicker of hope warming her chest. The next few weeks established a routine. Grace worked from morning until evening, serving food and washing dishes. Her pregnancy advanced, making movement more difficult, but Mrs. Cooper adjusted her duties accordingly, having her manage the cash box and orders while Maggie and the cook, a taciturn man named Frank, handled the heavier work. The room above the cafe became her home, small but private. Maggie proved to be a true friend, bringing Grace hand-me-down maternity clothing and sitting with her in the evenings, planning for the baby's arrival. Mrs. Abernathy on Pine Street is a midwife, Maggie told her. She's helped lots of women in the area, even those without husbands or means. She accepts payment in installments or trade. Grace felt a wave of gratitude for Maggie's practicality. I don't know what I'd have done without you, she admitted one evening as they sat by the small stove in Grace's room, mending linens for the cafe. Maggie shrugged, but her smile was warm. That's what friends do. Besides, I've always thought the way we treat women in your situation is wrong. As if being unmarried makes you unfit to be a mother. Grace's hand moved protectively to her belly, where the baby had been increasingly active. I worry about that, she confessed. Not just how people will treat me, but my child, growing up without a father bearing the stigma. Plenty of children grow up just fine with only a mother, Maggie reassured her. And you're strong, Grace. I've seen it these past weeks. You'll make a good life for your little one. Grace wanted to believe her, but doubt crept in during the quiet hours of the night. How would she manage alone? What if she fell ill? What if the prejudice against her extended to her innocent child? As her 8th month of pregnancy began, Grace's world narrowed to the cafe, her room, and occasional visits to Mrs. Abernathy to prepare for the birth. The midwife was reassuringly matter-of-fact about everything, from Grace's measurements to her fears. First babies usually take their time, Mrs. Abernathy told her. But when the pains start coming regular, you send for me right away. That friend of yours, Maggie, she knows where I live. Outside, autumn was painting Cedar City in golds and reds. Grace watched the changing season from her window, wondering what the coming winter would bring. She had saved most of her wages, adding them to what remained of her mother's gift, but the future beyond the birth remained a hazy, frightening prospect. The answer to her unspoken prayers arrived with the first snow of the season, in the form of a cattle drive passing through Cedar City on its way south to winter pastures. The Bluebird Cafe filled with cowboys that evening, bringing with them the smell of horses, leather, and the open range. Grace moved carefully among them, serving coffee and stew, her advanced pregnancy drawing curious but mostly respectful glances. She was returning to the kitchen when the door opened, bringing in a gust of cold air and a tall figure in a battered hat and duster covered with melting snowflakes. "Evening, madam," he said, removing his hat to reveal dark hair and eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. "Any chance of a hot meal for a cold rider?" "Of course," Grace replied, gesturing to an empty table in the corner. "I'll bring you some coffee right away." As she filled a cup from the pot on the stove, Maggie appeared beside her, eyes dancing with interest. "Did you see him? That's Ryan Blackburn. He runs the B Triangle Ranch south of here. They say he's the best horseman in 3 territories." Grace glanced over at the rancher, who was now warming his hands by the stove. He was handsome in a weathered way, with strong features and a quiet dignity that set him apart from the rowdier cowboys who worked for him. "He's certainly more civilized than most who come through here," Grace observed, noting how he'd hung his hat and duster neatly on the rack by the door. Maggie nudged her playfully. "And not wearing a wedding ring, I noticed." Grace rolled her eyes. "Maggie, I'm hardly in a position to be noticing such things." She gestured to her prominent belly. "Besides, what decent man would look twice at a woman in my situation?" "You'd be surprised," Maggie replied cryptically, before taking coffee to another table. Ryan Blackburn stayed longer than most, savoring his meal and then lingering over a second cup of coffee. When Grace brought him a slice of apple pie on the house at Mrs. Cooper's instruction, he thanked her with genuine warmth. "This is mighty kind of you, Miss Zimmerman." "Grace Zimmerman," she supplied, surprised at how easily her name came in response to his direct gaze. "Miss Zimmerman." He nodded respectfully. "I'm Ryan Blackburn." He hesitated, then added, "I hope you don't mind my saying, but you look like you might be due for some rest." "Should you be on your feet like this?" Grace was startled by his concern. Most men pretended not to notice her condition, as if pregnancy was something indecent. "I'm fine, Mr. Blackburn, but thank you for your concern." He nodded, still looking thoughtful. "My mother worked as a midwife back in Texas. She always said women did the hardest work in this world, bringing new life into it." Something in his simple statement touched Grace deeply. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman." She was. His smile held a hint of sadness. "She passed on 2 winters ago." "I'm sorry for your loss," Grace said sincerely. Ryan nodded in acknowledgement. "Life out here is hard on women especially. Too much work, too little help." He glanced around the cafe. "You have family nearby?" Grace stiffened slightly. "No, just myself." Understanding dawned in his eyes, but to his credit, no judgment followed. "Well then, I hope this town is treating you kindly, Miss Zimmerman." Before she could respond, a call from another table drew her away. When she returned to clear his dishes, Ryan Blackburn was preparing to leave, pulling on his duster and settling his hat on his head. "The pie was excellent," he told her, placing payment on the table with a generous tip. "If your coffee's this good tomorrow, I might have to stop in again before we drive the herd further south." Grace found herself hoping he would. The next day brought more snow and fewer customers to the Bluebird. Grace was wiping down tables when Ryan Blackburn entered, stamping snow from his boots and bringing with him the clean scent of winter air. "Miss Zimmerman," he greeted her with a tip of his hat. "I hope I'm not too late for that coffee." "The pot's always on, Mr. Blackburn," she replied, pleased despite herself at his return. He settled at the same table as the previous evening, and when Grace brought his coffee, he surprised her by asking, "Would you sit for a moment? If you're not too busy." Grace glanced around the nearly empty cafe. Only two miners remained at a far table, deep in their own conversation. I suppose I could for a minute or two. She lowered herself carefully into the chair opposite him, relieved to take the weight off her swollen feet. "How long have you been in Cedar City?" Ryan asked, sipping his coffee. "Just over a month," Grace answered. "It's a pleasant enough place." "But not home," he observed shrewdly. Grace looked down at her hands. "I'm not sure I have a home anymore, Mr. Blackburn." He nodded as if this confirmed something for him. "Call me Ryan, please, and if you don't mind my asking, what are your plans after?" He gestured vaguely toward her midsection. The directness of his question should have offended her, but somehow it didn't. Perhaps it was the genuine concern in his eyes, or the fact that he was the first person besides Maggie and Mrs. Cooper who had treated her pregnancy as something other than a scandal to be politely ignored. "I haven't decided yet," she admitted. "Mrs. Cooper has been kind enough to give me work and a place to stay for now. After the baby comes, I'll need to find something more permanent." Ryan's expression grew thoughtful. "It won't be easy, a woman alone with a child." "I'm aware of that, Mr. Blackburn." "Ryan," Grace replied, a touch of defensiveness creeping into her voice. "But I have no choice but to manage." He leaned forward slightly. "There are always choices, Miss Zimmerman. Sometimes they're just not the ones we expected to have." Before Grace could puzzle out his meaning, the door opened, admitting a group of his cowboys seeking refuge from the snow. Ryan excused himself to join them, and Grace returned to her duties, their unusual conversation lingering in her mind. Ryan Blackburn and his men remained in Cedar City for 3 more days while the snowstorm raged, making cattle driving impossible. Each day he visited the Bluebird, sometimes with his men, sometimes alone. Each time he sought Grace out for conversation. Grace learned that he had inherited the B Triangle Ranch from his uncle 5 years earlier, that he employed 15 cowboys year-round and more during the busy seasons, and that he had built a substantial herd of Hereford cattle that were in demand throughout the territories. In turn, she told him about growing up in her father's general store, her love of reading, and her dreams of one day seeing more of the country. She carefully avoided mentioning Silver Reef or the circumstances that had brought her to Cedar City, but Ryan never pressed her on these omissions. On the 4th day, the snow stopped and the sun emerged, brilliant against the white landscape. Grace was surprised to feel disappointment at the knowledge that Ryan and his men would soon continue their drive south. He arrived at the cafe earlier than usual, alone and carrying a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Miss Zimmerman, Grace," he began, setting the package on the counter between them. "I wanted to give you this before we leave." Grace untied the string and unfolded the paper to reveal a tiny knitted blanket in soft yellow wool. "Oh," she breathed, touching the delicate stitches. "It's beautiful. One of the women at a ranch where we stopped made it," Ryan explained. "I thought, well, every baby needs a blanket." Grace blinked rapidly against sudden tears. "Thank you. This is incredibly thoughtful," Ryan shifted, looking uncharacteristically nervous. "I have something else to say, and I hope you'll hear me out before answering." Grace nodded, curious at his serious tone. "I'm 34 years old," he began. "I've spent most of my life working cattle, building my ranch. It's good land with a solid house my uncle built. There's a garden that's gone to weeds since my aunt passed, and rooms that haven't seen use in too long." He took a deep breath. "What I'm trying to say is, I have a home, but no family to fill it." Grace stared at him, her heart beginning to race as she realized where his words might be leading. "I know we've only just met," Ryan continued, "and I'm not asking for feelings that haven't had time to grow. But I am offering you and your child a name, a home, and my protection if you want it." Grace felt as if the floor had tilted beneath her. "You're proposing marriage?" "I am." Ryan met her gaze steadily. "It would be a partnership, Grace. I need someone to make that house a home, and you need security for yourself and your child. The rest, well, that could develop in its own time if it's meant to." "But the child isn't yours," Grace protested, bewildered by his offer. "People will talk." A slight smile touched Ryan's lips. "People always talk. But out on the ranch, what matters is what's between you and the land and the people you choose as family. I'd give that baby my name, and no one who matters would question it." Grace's mind whirled with implications. "I hardly know you," she whispered. "That's true," Ryan acknowledged. "And I'm not asking for an answer today. We're staying in Cedar City one more night to rest the cattle. I'll come back tomorrow for your answer." After he left, Grace moved through her duties in a daze. When the cafe closed for the afternoon break, she sought out Maggie, who listened wide-eyed to the account of Ryan's proposal. "Are you going to accept?" Maggie demanded when Grace finished speaking. "I don't know," Grace admitted. "It's so sudden, and he's practically a stranger." "A stranger who's offering you and your child a respectable name and a home," Maggie pointed out. "Do you know how rare that is? Most men wouldn't look twice at a woman in your situation, let alone offer marriage." "That's precisely why I'm suspicious," Grace argued. "Why would he do this?" Maggie considered this. "He seems like a man who knows his own mind. Maybe he sees something in you that he's been looking for. Or maybe he's just a decent person who understands that life out here is hard enough without people making it harder with their judgments." Grace sighed, rubbing her lower back where an ache had been building all day. "What if I accept and it's a terrible mistake? What if he changes his mind once the baby is born? What if you refuse and spend years struggling alone when you could have had help?" Maggie countered. "Look, I'm not saying marry him because you have no options. I'm saying consider it because he seems like a good man offering a fair partnership." That night, Grace lay awake in her small room, the baby restless within her as if sensing her turmoil. She thought of her father's rejection, of the closed doors and averted eyes she'd encountered in both Silver Reef and Cedar City. She thought of the years ahead, trying to support a child alone in a world that looked down on women like her. Then she thought of Ryan Blackburn's steady gaze, his matter-of-fact kindness, and the simple dignity with which he'd made his offer. Not a romantic proposal, but perhaps something more valuable, a chance at a new beginning for her and her child. By morning, she had made her decision. Ryan arrived at the Bluebird just after noon, looking as if he too had passed a restless night. When Grace approached his table, he stood, hat in hands, waiting. "I've thought about your offer," Grace said quietly, "and I have some questions before I give you my answer." Ryan nodded. "Of course. Would you expect? That is, would this be a marriage in name only?" Grace felt her cheeks flush at the directness of the question. "I would expect it to be a real marriage," Ryan replied steadily. "But I would also respect your needs and your pace. I'm not offering charity, Grace. I'm offering a partnership between equals. And the child would be raised as mine," he said without hesitation, "with all the love and care I can provide." "Why?" Grace asked finally. "Why would you do this for a woman you barely know, carrying another man's child?" Ryan was silent for a moment. "My mother was 16 when she had me," he said finally. "My father was the son of a wealthy rancher who promised her the world, then disappeared when she told him she was expecting. She was alone, cast out by her family, with nowhere to turn." A muscle worked in his jaw. "A man named Thomas Blackburn found her crying by the side of a road. He offered her his name and a home, raised me as his own. He was the only father I ever knew or wanted." Understanding dawned in Grace's heart. "You're doing for me what he did for your mother." "Partly," Ryan admitted. "But also because in the few days I've known you, I've seen your strength, your dignity, your kindness. Those are qualities I'd value in a wife, in the mother of any children we might have together. I'm not offering charity, Grace. I'm offering a chance for both of us to build something good." Grace took a deep breath. "Then my answer is yes." The relief and pleasure that spread across Ryan's face was unmistakable. He reached for her hand, holding it gently. "I'll speak to the minister today. We can be married tomorrow before we leave if that suits you." "So soon?" Grace hadn't expected things to move so quickly. "The cattle need to get to winter pastures, and I'd rather not have you making the journey unmarried," Ryan explained. "Unless you'd prefer to wait here and join me later." The thought of Ryan leaving, of postponing this chance at security for her child, suddenly seemed unbearable. "No," Grace decided. "Tomorrow is fine." The wedding took place the following morning in Cedar City's small church. Grace wore her best dress, altered by Maggie's clever hands to accommodate her pregnancy. Mrs. Cooper and Frank from the cafe stood as witnesses, along with Ryan's foreman, a weathered man named Jim Hawkins. The ceremony was brief, the minister's tone disapproving when he noted Grace's condition, but Ryan's steady presence beside her made the man's judgment easier to bear. When it came time to place the ring on her finger, a simple gold band Ryan had purchased from the jeweler on Main Street, Grace was surprised by the emotion that welled up in her. "I, Ryan, take thee, Grace, to be my lawful wedded wife," he said clearly, his eyes never leaving hers. "To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." When Grace repeated the vows, her voice trembled slightly, but she meant every word. This might have begun as a practical arrangement, but there was something in Ryan's gentle strength that made her believe it could become more. After the ceremony, there was a small celebration at the Bluebird Cafe, where Mrs. Cooper had prepared a special meal and Maggie had decorated with winter greenery. "You take care of her," Maggie instructed Ryan fiercely. "She deserves someone who sees her worth." Ryan nodded, solemn. "I intend to." The journey south to the B Triangle Ranch took 3 days, traveling slowly because of the cattle and Grace's condition. Ryan insisted she ride in the chuck wagon rather than on horseback, making sure she was as comfortable as possible on the rough trails. At night, they camped with the herd and Ryan made a separate tent for Grace, treating her with a respect that both relieved and puzzled her. They were married now, yet he maintained a careful distance, as if understanding she needed time to adjust to this sudden change in her circumstances. On the evening of the 3rd day, they crested a rise, and the B Triangle Ranch spread out before them, a broad valley with a creek winding through it, pastures dotted with cattle, and at its center, a substantial 2-story house with a wide porch. "Home," Ryan said simply, drawing his horse alongside the wagon where Grace sat. "What do you think?" Grace took in the scene: the well-maintained barns, the bunkhouse where the Cowboys would live, the corrals and outbuildings that marked a prosperous operation. But it was the house that drew her attention most: whitewashed walls, green shutters, a curl of smoke rising from the chimney. "It's beautiful," she said honestly. "Who's looking after things while you're gone, Mrs.? Wilkins comes up from town to keep the house in order, and my segundo, Miguel, manages the ranch operations when I'm away," Ryan explained. "They're expecting us." As they approached, a Mexican man in his 40s emerged from the barn and a plump woman with gray, streaked hair appeared on the porch. Both looked curiously at Grace as Ryan helped her down from the wagon. "Miguel, Mrs. Wilkins, I'd like you to meet my wife, Grace," Ryan announced, his hand supportive at the small of Grace's back. If they were surprised by their employer's sudden marriage to a heavily pregnant woman, they hid it well. Mrs. Wilkins stepped forward with a warm smile. "Welcome to the B Triangle, Mrs. Blackburn. I've prepared the house for you." Grace stumbled slightly at the unfamiliar name Mrs. Blackburn but recovered quickly. "Thank you. I look forward to learning about my new home." Miguel touched the brim of his hat respectfully. "Bienvenida, Senora. The ranch has needed a woman's touch for too long." Ryan squeezed her shoulder gently. "Let's get you inside. You must be exhausted from the journey." The interior of the house was spacious and well built, with a large kitchen and dining area, a comfortable parlor with bookshelves, and upstairs, several bedrooms including a master suite with its own sitting area. The furniture was solid but sparse, and Grace could see what Ryan had meant about the place needing a woman's touch. There were no curtains on most windows, no cushions or throws to soften the wooden chairs, no pictures on the walls except for a single portrait of an older couple Grace assumed were Ryan's aunt and uncle. "Mrs. Wilkins has prepared the master bedroom for us," Ryan said, carrying Grace's bag upstairs. "But if you'd prefer your own room for now, there are plenty to choose from." Grace hesitated. They were married, and yet they were still strangers in many ways. "I think that might be best until we know each other better." Ryan nodded, unsurprised. "The room across the hall has a nice view of the mountains. We can have it ready in no time." That night, after a dinner prepared by Mrs. Wilkins, Grace sat in her new bedroom, looking out at the star-filled sky above the ranch. She could hear the distant sounds of cattle, the occasional call of a night bird, the creak of the house settling. It was peaceful in a way Cedar City had never been, and for the first time since leaving Silver Reef, Grace felt a sense of possibility unfurling within her. A soft knock at the door roused her from her thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting Mrs. Wilkins with extra blankets or something similar. Instead, it was Ryan, changed from his travel clothes into a clean shirt and trousers. "I wanted to make sure you have everything you need," he said, remaining in the doorway. "Yes, thank you. Everyone has been very kind." Ryan nodded, then hesitated. "Grace, I want you to know that this is your home now. Make any changes you see fit. Tell Mrs. Wilkins how you want things done. Get to know the operations at your own pace. I don't expect you to immediately take over the running of the house, especially with the baby coming so soon." Grace was touched by his consideration. "I appreciate that, but I'd like to contribute as soon as I'm able. I'm not afraid of hard work." "I know that." Ryan's smile was warm. "It's one of the things I admired about you from the start." He shifted slightly. "Well, good night then. If you need anything, I'm just across the hall." "Good night, Ryan, and thank you for everything." After he left, Grace changed into her nightgown and climbed into the unfamiliar bed, her hand resting on her belly where the baby kicked energetically. "Well, little one," she whispered, "it seems we've found ourselves a home after all." The next 2 weeks were a period of adjustment as Grace settled into life at the B Triangle. Mrs. Wilkins was a treasure, showing her around the house and explaining its workings, from the root cellar where vegetables were stored to the linen closets with their neatly folded sheets and quilts. "Mr. Blackburn's aunt kept a fine house," Mrs. Wilkins explained. "But since she passed 3 years ago, it's been just the basics. That man can run a cattle operation better than anyone in the territory, but he doesn't notice when curtains need washing or floors need polishing." Grace gradually began taking over some household duties, planning meals with Mrs. Wilkins and learning about the rhythm of ranch life, the early morning start as cowboys rode out to check the herds, the midday meal that needed to be substantial enough to fuel hard physical labor, the evening gatherings in the bunkhouse where the men played cards or music after their work was done. Ryan was busy with ranch operations, often riding out before dawn and returning late, tired but always making time to sit with Grace in the evening, telling her about his day and asking about hers. They were developing a friendship, Grace realized, a foundation upon which something deeper might grow. One evening, about a week after their arrival, Grace was in the kitchen with Mrs. Wilkins when she felt a sharp pain in her lower back. She gasped, bracing herself against the table. "Mrs. Blackburn." Mrs. Wilkins was immediately at her side. "Is it the baby? I'm not sure," Grace admitted as the pain subsided. "It could be just from standing too long." Mrs. Wilkins looked skeptical. "You sit down now. I'll fetch Mr. Blackburn." "There's no need to worry him," Grace protested, but another pain stronger than the first made her reconsider. Ryan arrived quickly, his expression concerned. "Mrs. Wilkins says you're having pains. Should I send Miguel for the doctor in town?" "It might be nothing," Grace said, but even as the words left her mouth, she felt a warm rush of fluid down her legs. "Or perhaps not nothing after all," she amended, eyes widening. Ryan didn't hesitate. "Miguel," he called, and the segundo appeared instantly. "Ride for Dr. Evans. Tell him Mrs. Blackburn's time has come." The labor progressed rapidly after that. Mrs. Wilkins, who had assisted at many births, helped Grace upstairs to the master bedroom, which had the largest bed, while Ryan paced anxiously below. "First babies usually take their time," Mrs. Wilkins reassured Grace as she helped her change into a clean nightgown. "But some come quick, like they're eager to see the world." This baby, it seemed, was of the eager variety. By the time Dr. Evans arrived 2 hours later, Grace was already fully in the throes of labor, gripping the bedposts and breathing through intense contractions. "You're doing wonderfully, Mrs. Blackburn," the doctor assured her after his examination. "The baby is in the perfect position. It won't be long now." Ryan had been banished to the hallway, but Grace could hear his footsteps as he paced back and forth. When a particularly strong contraction hit, and she couldn't suppress a cry, the footsteps stopped abruptly outside the door. "She's fine, Mr. Blackburn," Mrs. Wilkins called. "Just doing the hardest work there is." Grace barely registered the exchange, focused entirely on the overwhelming sensations of her body. The doctor's instructions seemed to come from far away as he guided her through the final stages. "Push now, Mrs. Blackburn. That's it. One more big push." The relief when the baby finally slipped into the world was indescribable. A moment of silence, then a lusty cry filled the room. "You have a son, Mrs. Blackburn," Dr. Evans announced, placing the squalling, red-faced infant on Grace's chest. "A healthy boy." Grace stared down at her son in wonder, counting tiny fingers and toes, marveling at the perfection of his small face. "Hello," she whispered, tears flowing freely. "I've waited so long to meet you." Mrs. Wilkins opened the bedroom door. "Mr. Blackburn, you can come in now, meet your son." Ryan entered hesitantly, his eyes fixing immediately on the bundle in Grace's arms. He approached the bed slowly, as if afraid to disturb the tableau before him. "He's beautiful," he said softly, and Grace was surprised to see moisture in his eyes. "May I?" Grace nodded, and Ryan carefully sat on the edge of the bed, studying the baby's face with rapt attention. "He has your nose, I think. Would you like to hold him?" Grace offered, feeling suddenly, unexpectedly right about sharing this moment with this man who had given them both his name and protection. Ryan accepted the baby with careful hands, cradling him as if he were made of the finest porcelain. "Hello, son," he murmured. "Welcome to the B Triangle." Grace watched them, this man and her child, and felt something shift in her heart. This was family, however unconventional its beginning. "What will you name him?" Ryan asked, looking up from the baby to meet her eyes. Grace hesitated. She hadn't given much thought to names, too focused on surviving one day at a time. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "Do you have any thoughts?" Ryan seemed surprised to be consulted. "I'd be honored if you'd consider Thomas after the man who raised me, but it's your decision, Grace." "Thomas," Grace repeated, testing the name. "Thomas Blackburn, it sounds strong." "Like his mother," Ryan said with quiet admiration. In that moment, with her son in her husband's arms and the pain of childbirth already beginning to fade from memory, Grace felt the first real stirrings of love for the man who had saved them both. The weeks following Thomas's birth were a blur of exhaustion and joy for Grace. The baby thrived, growing stronger each day, his lusty cries echoing through the ranch house at all hours. Ryan proved to be an unexpectedly involved father, often appearing in the nursery in the middle of the night to walk with Thomas when he was fussy, giving Grace precious hours of sleep. "You don't have to do that," Grace told him one morning after finding him dozing in the rocking chair with Thomas peacefully asleep on his chest. "He's not your responsibility." Ryan's expression grew serious. "He is, Grace. From the moment I offered you my name, he became my son in every way that matters. I meant what I said in Cedar City." Grace felt tears prick her eyes. "Most men wouldn't feel that way." "Most men are fools," Ryan replied simply, carefully transferring the sleeping baby to his cradle. As winter settled over the ranch, bringing shorter days and long, cozy evenings, Grace found herself looking forward to the time when ranch work ended, and Ryan would join her by the fire in the parlor. They would talk for hours about books they had read, places they had seen, dreams they had for the future. Sometimes Ryan would read aloud while Grace mended clothing or worked on the quilt she was making for Thomas's cradle. By Christmas, when Thomas was 6 weeks old, Grace realized that their marriage of convenience had become something much deeper, at least for her. She had fallen in love with her husband, with his quiet strength and unwavering integrity, with the tenderness he showed their son, and the respect he showed her. But Ryan had maintained a careful physical distance since their wedding day, never presuming on his rights as a husband. They still occupied separate bedrooms, and though he was affectionate in small ways, a hand at the small of her back, a touch on her shoulder as he passed, he had never attempted to kiss her or suggest they move toward a more intimate relationship. Grace wondered if perhaps his offer had truly been one of charity after all, if he had no interest in her as a woman, only as a mother to Thomas and a keeper of his home. The opportunity to discover the truth came on Christmas Eve. The ranch hands had been given the day off to celebrate, and Mrs. Wilkins had gone to town to spend the holiday with her sister, leaving Grace and Ryan alone with the baby for the first time since their arrival at the B Triangle. Grace had decorated the house with pine boughs and red ribbons, and prepared a special dinner, wearing the new dress she had sewn for the occasion, a rich green wool that complemented her auburn hair, which had regained its luster since Thomas's birth. Ryan had brought in a small pine tree, setting it up in the parlor and helping Grace decorate it with paper stars she had cut out and painted gold. Thomas lay on a blanket nearby, watching the flickering candles with wide-eyed fascination. "This is his first Christmas," Grace observed, adjusting a star that had tilted. "The first of many here, I hope." Ryan, standing behind her with another star in hand, paused. "You're happy here then?" Grace turned to face him. "Very happy. You've given us more than I ever dared hope for, Ryan." His expression softened. "You've brought life back to this house, Grace. Before you came, it was just a place to sleep between days of work. Now it's a home again." Emboldened by the warmth in his eyes, Grace took a step closer. "I've been wondering something." "What's that?" Ryan asked, his voice dropping slightly. "When you proposed in Cedar City, you said this would be a real marriage. yet you've never." She faltered, suddenly shy. Ryan set the star down carefully on a nearby table. "I wanted to give you time," he said quietly. "To adjust to motherhood, to life here, to me." "And if I don't need any more time?" Grace asked, her heart pounding. Ryan's eyes darkened. "Grace, are you saying—" "I'm saying that I married you for security and protection," Grace said, taking another step toward him. "But somewhere along the way, I found myself falling in love with the man who gave my son his name and me a home." Ryan's hands came up to frame her face, his touch gentle as a whisper. "I've loved you since the moment you stood in the Bluebird Cafe, serving coffee with your head held high despite everything you'd been through. I just never dared hope you might come to feel the same." Their first kiss was tender, a question and an answer all at once. When they parted, Grace saw in Ryan's eyes the same wonder she felt in her own heart. "Merry Christmas, Mrs. Blackburn," he whispered. "Merry Christmas, husband," she replied, smiling up at him. That night, Grace moved her belongings into the master bedroom, and their marriage was truly consummated not as a duty or obligation, but as an expression of deep and growing love between two people who had found each other against all odds. Spring came early to the valley that year, bringing with it new calves, wildflowers, and the first letter from Silver Reef. Grace recognized her mother's handwriting immediately, and her hands trembled as she opened the envelope. Inside was a brief note, along with a small package. "My dearest Grace, your father does not know I am writing. A friend passing through Cedar City mentioned you had married a rancher named Blackburn and moved south. I pray this letter finds you well. I think of you and your child every day. Please write if you can, and know that my love for you has never wavered, though I lacked the courage to show it when you needed me most. With all my heart, Mother." The package contained a silver rattle that had been Grace's own as a baby. She held it to her chest, tears flowing freely as emotions she had suppressed for months finally broke free. Ryan found her like that, sitting on the porch with the letter and rattle in her lap. Wordlessly, he sat beside her, one arm around her shoulders as she told him about Silver Reef, about her father's rejection and her mother's silent complicity. "Write to her," Ryan urged when she had finished. "Tell her about Thomas, about your life here. Perhaps in time she might visit." "What about my father?" Grace asked. "He declared I was no longer his daughter." Ryan's jaw tightened. "That was his choice and his loss, but your mother is reaching out. That takes courage, Grace." Grace nodded, leaning against his solid warmth. "I'll write tomorrow, and Ryan, thank you for understanding." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Family is what we make it, Grace. I learned that from Thomas Blackburn, and I hope to teach it to our son. Our son." The words still warmed Grace's heart every time Ryan said them, a reminder that love could create bonds as strong as blood. The letter to her mother began a tentative correspondence that continued through the spring and summer. Sarah Zimmerman wrote of everyday happenings in Silver Reef, careful never to mention Herbert directly, though Grace gathered from between the lines that her father remained unbending in his judgment. In August, when Thomas was 8 months old and beginning to crawl, scooting across the ranch house floors with determined energy, Grace discovered she was expecting again this time, Ryan's child. The joy with which he received the news confirmed what she had come to know deeply in her heart, that this man saw no distinction between the child he had claimed and the one they had created together. "2 children under 2 will be a handful," Grace observed as they lay in bed that night, Ryan's hand resting protectively over her still flat stomach. "We'll manage," Ryan assured her. "Maybe we'll even hire a girl to help with the housework so you don't overtax yourself." Grace turned to look at him in the moonlight filtering through the window. "You know, A year ago I was alone, cast out, with no idea how I would support myself and my child. Now I have you, this ranch, a beautiful son, and another baby on the way. Sometimes I can hardly believe how much has changed." Ryan's fingers traced the line of her cheek. "Do you ever regret it? Saying yes to a stranger who proposed after knowing you less than a week?" Grace smiled, catching his hand and bringing it to her lips. "Not for a moment. It was the best decision I ever made." "Mine too," Ryan murmured, drawing her closer for a kiss that spoke of deep belonging and endless days ahead. In October, a surprise arrival at the B Triangle brought the past full circle. Grace was in the garden, harvesting the last of the summer vegetables with Thomas playing on a blanket nearby, when the sound of an approaching wagon drew her attention. She shaded her eyes against the autumn sun, trying to make out the visitors. It wasn't unusual for people to stop at the ranch, neighbors, cowboys looking for work, the occasional traveling salesman. But something about the woman sitting stiffly in the passenger seat of this wagon made Grace's heart skip. "Mother," she whispered, hardly daring to believe her eyes. Sarah Zimmerman climbed down from the wagon with the help of the driver, a young man Grace didn't recognize. She stood uncertainly at the garden gate, looking older and thinner than Grace remembered, but unmistakably her mother. "Grace," Sarah said, her voice catching. "I hope. That is, your letters said we would be welcome." Grace was across the garden in moments, Thomas hoisted to her hip, embracing her mother with her free arm. "Of course you're welcome. I can't believe you're really here." Sarah drew back slightly to look at her grandson, tears welling in her eyes. "This must be Thomas. Oh, Grace, he's beautiful. Would you like to hold him?" Grace offered, and the look of joy on her mother's face as she accepted the baby was answer enough. The driver of the wagon, who introduced himself as Peter Collins, a new clerk at the general store, explained that he had brought Mrs. Zimmerman as far as the nearest town, where Ryan had arranged for one of the ranch hands to meet them and guide them the rest of the way to the B Triangle. "Mr. Zimmerman believes his wife is visiting her sister in Provo," Peter confided to Grace as they unloaded Sarah's bags. "She doesn't intend to stay more than 2 weeks." Grace understood the constraints her mother was under, but even 2 weeks seemed like a miracle after believing she might never see her family again. Ryan returned from checking the herds to find his mother-in-law settled in the parlor with Thomas on her lap. His welcome was warm and genuine, putting Sarah immediately at ease. "So you're the man who saved my daughter," Sarah said that evening over dinner. Ryan shook his head. "Grace saved herself with her courage and determination. I just offered her the partnership she deserved." Sarah glanced between them, noting the obvious affection in their exchanges. "And now we're building a life together," Grace answered, her hand finding Ryan's across the table. "A real one based on respect and love." "And soon to be expanded," Ryan added with a smile, and Sarah's eyes widened as she understood their meaning. "Another grandchild," she breathed, looking as if she hardly dared hope for such joy. "In the spring," Grace confirmed. "You'll have to visit again to meet your newest grandchild." Sarah's expression clouded briefly. "Your father need never know," Ryan said firmly. "Our door is always open to you, Mrs. Zimmerman, whenever you can come." The 2 weeks of Sarah's visit passed too quickly. She threw herself into life at the ranch with enthusiasm, helping Grace prepare for the new baby, spending hours with Thomas, and even assisting Mrs. Wilkins with canning the last of the garden produce for winter. When it was time for her to leave, the parting was tearful but not final. "I'll write when the baby comes," Grace promised as they embraced by the waiting wagon. "And perhaps next year." "I'll find a way," Sarah assured her. "Now that I know where you are, how well you are, I won't lose you again." As the wagon disappeared down the ranch road, Ryan put his arm around Grace's shoulders. "Are you all right?" Grace nodded, leaning into his strength. "Better than all right. A year ago I thought I'd lost my family forever. Now I have a new one and parts of my old one too." Ryan pressed a kiss to her temple. "Life has a way of surprising us. Like a cowboy offering his name to a woman and her unborn child," Grace teased gently. "Exactly like that," Ryan agreed, his smile tender as he looked down at her. "Best decision I ever made." The winter of 1879 passed peacefully at the B Triangle. Thomas took his first steps just before Christmas, toddling unsteadily across the parlor floor into Ryan's waiting arms. Grace's pregnancy progressed without complications, her growing belly a source of fascination to Thomas, who would pat it gently and listen wide-eyed when Ryan explained that a baby brother or sister was growing inside. Letters arrived regularly from Sarah, who had returned safely to Silver Reef with a cover story about her sister's health that Herbert had accepted without question. She wrote of her plans to visit again when the new baby arrived, having already concocted a story about another family emergency that would require her presence. In April, as wildflowers began carpeting the valley floor and new calves wobbled alongside their mothers in the pastures, Grace gave birth to a daughter they named Elizabeth Sarah Blackburn. Ryan was as besotted with his daughter as he was with Thomas, spending hours simply watching her sleep or carrying her against his broad chest as he went about his ranch business. "She has your eyes," he told Grace one evening as they sat on the porch swing, Thomas playing with wooden blocks at their feet and Elizabeth nursing contentedly. "And your determination," Grace replied with a smile. "Have you noticed how she stares at things, as if she's figuring out how they work?" Ryan laughed, his arm warm around Grace's shoulders. "Between Thomas's energy and Elizabeth's focus, we're going to have our hands full." "I wouldn't have it any other way," Grace said softly, looking out over the ranch that had become her home at the man who had become her heart and the children who were their shared joy. Years passed, and the B Triangle prospered. Thomas grew into a strapping boy with his mother's auburn hair and a natural affinity for horses that made Ryan proud. Elizabeth, fair-haired and serious, showed an early interest in books and learning, devouring every volume in the ranch house and begging for more whenever Ryan went to town. They were joined by a brother, James, in 1882, and finally twin girls, Margaret and Catherine, in 1885, completing their family and filling the once quiet ranch house with laughter, arguments, and the endless activity of 5 children growing up together. Sarah visited regularly, usually twice a year, watching her grandchildren grow with a joy that almost compensated for the ongoing deception required to maintain these precious connections. Herbert never relented in his position regarding Grace, even as the years passed. But Grace found that the pain of his rejection had dulled with time and the fullness of her life at the B Triangle. In the spring of 1888, 10 years after Grace had been cast out of Silver Reef, a letter arrived bearing news that Herbert Zimmerman had suffered a stroke and was not expected to recover. Sarah wrote in desperation, asking if Grace might consider coming to see him one last time. "It's a fool's errand," Ryan said when Grace showed him the letter. "That man cast you out when you needed him most. Why should you go to him now?" Grace sighed, looking out the window to where their children were playing in the yard. Thomas, now 10, supervising his younger siblings with the seriousness of a young man aware of his responsibilities. "Because he's still my father. Because I don't want to live with the regret of not trying one last time to make peace." Ryan studied her face, then nodded. "Then we'll all go. I won't have you facing him alone." The journey to Silver Reef was strange for Grace, a retracing of steps taken in fear and shame a decade earlier, now made with a loving husband and 5 beautiful children beside her. The town had changed little, the same church steeple piercing the sky, the same general store, now with Zimmerman and Son painted above the door. Grace noticed. Anchoring the main street, Sarah met them at the door of the house behind the store, her face lined with worry and relief. "He's upstairs," she said after embracing each of her grandchildren. "The doctor says it won't be long now." "Children, stay with your grandmother," Ryan instructed, his hand firm at Grace's back as they climbed the familiar stairs to her parents' bedroom. Herbert Zimmerman lay in the large bed that had dominated this room throughout Grace's childhood. He seemed diminished somehow, his once imposing frame shrunken, his face gray and slack on one side from the stroke. His eyes, however, were alert, and they widened when Grace entered the room. "Father," Grace said softly, approaching the bed, "I've come home." Herbert made a sound, unintelligible due to his condition, but his good hand moved restlessly on the coverlet. "I'm not alone," Grace continued, gesturing for Ryan to step forward. "This is my husband, Ryan Blackburn. And downstairs with Mother are our children Thomas, Elizabeth, James, Margaret, and Catherine." Another sound from Herbert, his eyes now fixed on Ryan, who met the older man's gaze steadily. "You should know, sir," Ryan said, his voice respectful but firm, "that your daughter has built a fine life. She's loved and respected throughout our region. Our children are a credit to her strength and character." Herbert's eyes moved back to Grace, and she was startled to see tears gathering in them. "I forgive you, Father," Grace said quietly, reaching for his hand, "for sending me away. It hurt beyond words at the time, but it led me to Ryan, to our ranch, to the life I was meant to have." A tear slipped down Herbert's cheek, and his fingers tightened weakly around Grace's. "Would you like to meet your grandchildren?" Grace asked, and after a moment, Herbert managed a small nod. The children filed in quietly, standing at the foot of the bed with expressions ranging from curiosity to nervousness. Grace introduced each one, sharing a small detail about their personalities or interests. Herbert watched them intently, his eyes lingering on Thomas, now a handsome boy on the cusp of adolescence. "Thomas was my first," Grace said, understanding her father's focus. "Ryan gave him his name before he was born and has raised him as his own from the first day." Herbert's gaze shifted to Ryan, a question in his eyes. "Family is more than blood, Mr. Zimmerman," Ryan said simply. "Thomas is my son in every way that matters." Something in Herbert's expression changed, then a softening, a surrender perhaps. He gestured weakly for Sarah, who had been watching from the doorway, to come closer. With great effort and Sarah's help, Herbert managed to form a few halting words. "I was wrong." Grace felt tears spring to her eyes at this unexpected concession. "It's in the past now, Father." Herbert shook his head slightly, determined to continue. "Proud of you." The words she had longed to hear throughout her childhood and young adulthood, finally given when she no longer needed them for validation. Yet they healed something in Grace that she hadn't realized was still wounded. "Thank you, Father," she whispered. Herbert Zimmerman died peacefully that night, with Sarah at his side and Grace and her family in the next room. The funeral was held 2 days later, with many of Silver Reef's residents expressing surprise and curiosity at the return of the disgraced daughter, now obviously prosperous and respected, with her handsome husband and 5 well-behaved children. "Let them talk," Ryan said quietly as they stood at the graveside. "Their opinions don't define you, Grace. They never did." After the burial, there were practical matters to address. Herbert had left the store to his clerk, Peter Collins, who had become like a son to him over the years. The house and its contents, along with a modest sum of money, went to Sarah. "What will you do now, Mother?" Grace asked as they sat in the parlor that evening, the children already in bed after the emotional day. Sarah looked around the room where she had spent so many years. "I'm not sure. This house holds many memories, not all of them happy." "Come to the B Triangle," Ryan suggested. "We have plenty of room and the children would love having their grandmother with them all the time." "You wouldn't mind an old woman underfoot?" Sarah asked, looking surprised and hopeful. "Your family," Ryan said simply. "And the B Triangle is where family belongs." The decision made, they spent the next week packing Sarah's belongings and settling Herbert's affairs. When they finally boarded the train that would take them south, Grace felt a strange sense of completion, as if a circle that had begun with her desperate flight from Silver Reef had finally closed. As the train pulled away, Grace looked out the window at the town where she had been born and raised, and then cast out. She felt no bitterness now, only a gentle recognition that sometimes the hardest paths lead to the most beautiful destinations. Ryan's hand covered hers on the seat between them. "Ready to go home?" he asked. Grace smiled, thinking of the ranch waiting for them, the life they had built together, the future still unfolding before them. "Yes," she said, "I'm ready to go home." "You know," Ryan said thoughtfully, watching their children pointing excitedly at passing scenery, 10 years ago, when I walked into that cafe in Cedar City, I never imagined how much my life would change." "Do you ever regret it?" Grace asked. "Taking on a pregnant woman you barely knew, giving her child your name." Ryan's expression softened as he looked at her, the love of a decade shining in his eyes. "Not for a single moment. Meeting you, Grace Zimmerman, was the best thing that ever happened to me." Grace leaned her head against his shoulder, content in the knowledge that what had begun as an act of kindness from a decent man had grown into the deepest love either of them had ever known, a love that had given a name to a child who needed one, a home to a woman cast out, and in return had filled a lonely ranch with the laughter and love of the family they had built together.